Hello and welcome to The Narrow Way. My name is Alex, I'm a therapist, and in this video we're going to be having a look at the life of Thérèse of Lisieux, a very popular saint within the Catholic Church, and exploring how her little way can help you to transform suffering into strength. Now, Thérèse was born in 1873 in Alençon, France, to devoutly Catholic parents. She was the seventh of 9 children, 4 of whom passed away before Thérèse was born. And when she was just 4 years old, her mother also passed away from breast cancer. Now, Thérèse was a sensitive child and suffered with both her physical and her mental health. But at the age of 13, she experienced a religious conversion, and then at 15 became a Carmelite nun, joining a convent. She lived there quietly and humbly, and many of her fellow nuns considered her unremarkable. And then at the age of just 24, Thérèse herself passed away from tuberculosis. But a couple of years prior to that happening, under instruction from the mothers at the convent, Thérèse began writing her autobiography, which would later become known as The Story of a Soul. And it was only after she died and her writings were read that her fellow nuns really realised the depth of her holiness and her spirituality. The Story of a Soul was published a year after her death and quickly spread throughout the Catholic world, and the popularity and success of her writings led to her being canonised in 1925, and then in 1997 she was made a Doctor of the Church, one of the very few women to ever hold that title. So in this video we're going to be having a look at her thinking, her teaching and her approaches to spirituality and how they might be helpful for you. Now, reflecting on Thérèse's early life, we can see a significant amount of loss there. And as I mentioned, she also suffered both physically and mentally. In The Story of a Soul, she says, reflecting on this period of her life, that she was seized with such violent fits of scruples that she trembled in every limb. Scruples being the fear of doing something immoral or offending God in some way. Now, reflecting on that quote from a contemporary perspective, we might say that Thérèse was experiencing OCD or panic attacks. Now, these are things that I frequently encounter in my work as a therapist, and they can be approached from a variety of directions, from looking at the unconscious conflicts that cause anxiety up to the behaviours that exacerbate it. But Thérèse herself had a different way of thinking about her struggles when she said, "It is my weakness that makes all my strength." Now, her approach became known as the Little Way, and there's a real emphasis there on childlike simplicity, humility and dependence on God. One gospel passage that can be easily associated with her is from Matthew, and it's the one that says, "Unless you become like little children, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven." And these can be challenging concepts for people, especially adults. I think being referred to as childish can often be, is often used as an insult. And we don't want to think of ourselves as little and weak, but rather big and strong and capable. Now, Thérèse isn't saying that we can't take responsibility or have important jobs. In fact, she says that her way is for people of any office. But I think what she's encouraging us to do is to consider and to think about the qualities of childhood in a spiritual and a supernatural sense. Now, when we reflect on the nature of the relationship between a small child and a mother, for example, we would hopefully see certain traits and characteristics there, such as a mutual and reciprocal love, a trust and a dependency. A small child doesn't seek to do everything for itself. It's fully aware of its limitations and therefore asks for help when it needs it, and it asks for help with the knowledge and the belief that those needs are going to be met, because whilst there are things that it can and perhaps should do for itself, there are also things that it can't. And Thérèse might say that coming to terms with our limitations as adults allows us to create a relationship with God where we trust on His strength rather than our own. And she is someone that was more than aware of her own limitations. When speaking about climbing the stairs of perfection, she described herself as too tiny to be able to do that, and said that to get there I need not grow, on the contrary I must remain little, I must become still less. So she realised that there were certain heights that she couldn't get to by herself, and that actually what she needed to do was to make herself small enough to allow God to carry her. And this doesn't just apply in an individual sense either. I think by coming to terms with our frailties, our weaknesses, our limitations, we're better able to recognise those traits in other people as well, and to treat them with compassion and respect, and mirror the love that we see Christ showing to the vulnerable in the Gospels. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that we make ourselves suffer on purpose, or that we don't take action, or we don't plan, or we don't take responsibility for things. As a therapist, I think one of the most important and bravest things that people can do is to ask for help and to seek support when they need it. But I think it's just realising that actually there are certain things and sufferings that are beyond our control, and how we respond to those is important. And if we respond to them from a place of humility and for asking for help, then that can help us to approach them in a more productive way, perhaps, than trying to solve everything ourselves. Now, thinking about St. Thérèse, her life and her writings, what are some of the things that we can do in order to cultivate a more childlike and dependent relationship with God? Now, something that I believe is very clear from her work is her faith and trust in God, and the belief that He wants what's best for us. Now, that might sound obvious, but I think God can often be experienced as someone or something that we're in competition with, or that wants to hold us back and prevent us from doing the things that we really want to do. But Thérèse herself said, what wounds Christ to the heart is a lack of confidence in Him. And if we think about the Gospels, they're full of examples of us being told to pray for the things that we need, with the faith that those prayers will be met. But I think it's also important to consider that if we don't get exactly what we want when we want, then perhaps there's a reason for that. In the way that a loving and responsible parent doesn't always cave into the demands of its child, perhaps we can think of God the Father in a similar way too. Now, something else that I think Thérèse really focused on in her life was the value of simplicity. She wasn't about grand, heroic deeds, but doing simple daily tasks with love, care and attention. In fact, she said, in my little way there are only quite ordinary things. All that I do, little souls must be able to do also. And if we think of children and how they play, for example, they're not worried about what's going to happen next week or next month or next year. They're very focused on what they're doing. And of course, that doesn't mean that we can't have ambitions or that we can't plan for things, but that little things can hold just as much value as well. But I think what's most inspiring about St. Thérèse and her life is that even though she faced all these hardships, she still ascended to the highest heights of the Catholic Church. And it wasn't in spite of her problems, but rather because of them and her unique way of approaching them. She didn't rely on herself to try and fix all her problems, but she looked to God for help with the things that she felt like she couldn't do for herself. And I think there's something very relatable about that. So we've really just scratched the surface today in terms of her writings and her work, so perhaps that's something that you can look into more if you would like to. If there's something about her that you particularly like, feel free to leave a comment in the section, like and subscribe, and thank you for watching today, and I hope to see you again soon.